A forest ranger found something in the woods that told him, "It's good to see you again, 800 years later. What would you do next?" That line is the pulse at the center of this story. It is the promise and the problem. An ordinary man, a voice in the silence of times, and a claim that ties him to a past he never lived and a duty he never asked for. By the time you hear the words in this video, you'll already be holding the shock between your hands. But before the explanation, before the wider implications spread outward like ripples, there is the moment itself. The hum, the blue-silver light, the crystalline thing beneath a juniper tree, and a man who has spent his life listening to the land. If you want more mysteries told with careful attention to detail and calm, sustained wonder, subscribe now and stay with us through the whole reconstruction. Daniel Carter had the look of someone who belonged to a place, not just in the sweaters patched at the elbow or in the thin white scar above his brow from a falling branch, but in the way his hands remembered where roots hid, where the stone along a dry gulch would throw a foot in bad weather, how the wind read the faces of the hills. He was 37, lean from hikes and brief weeks of winter work, with hair the color of ash and a voice that fell low when he talked about the land as if it were a living thing he owed money to. He knew the map like it was stitched into the back of his skull. Ridge lines and fire breaks, springs that always trickled, meadows that flushed with columbine in May, the old logging route that had become a deer trail. The job had been steady and solitary after his grandfather died. That grandfather had been a botanist who taught him to look at a leaf as if it were a sentence, every vein a clause, each discoloration a story. "Listen to the margins," the old man used to say. It became Daniel's way of being, a habit of tuned awareness, a small devotion practiced in weather and cold and quiet. On an overcast late October morning, Daniel followed that devotion deeper than usual. The fire season had been mild that year, but heat and drought were thin debts in the soil. The wood smelled like old coal and resin. He had wakened before dawn in his small cabin, leather mug in hand, watched a thin frost dissolve along the porch rail, and decided to check a remote transect near a stand of pinyon and juniper that flagged on the GPS as anomalous readings the ranger team had chalked up to sensor interference. There was nothing to indicate this would be anything beyond a maintenance route. Routine, the kind of day that, to someone like Daniel, was a net of small rules and measured risk. He moved with the economy of intention, an early path across hummocks, a single crow harried into the trees. Then a sound, not wind, not animal, a sustained low tone, a vibration under the chest that could have been a truck idling in the valley. He stopped, brushed his fingers across the trunk of a pinyon, closed his eyes, and the hum threaded into the underlay of the forest like a second heartbeat. It was neither entirely mechanical nor wholly natural. It sat between the two, a harmonized frequency that the land did not reject. The hum became a guide. Following it, Daniel turned into a hollow that new water had cut the last spring. The light narrowed through the canopy. The sky, a dull pewter, threw shards of cold light in vertical columns. The hum rose, an answered tone to his footsteps. And there, in a pocket of bare earth ringed by stones like the bones of something once living, he found it. It did not look like anything he'd seen in field guides. It was neither rock nor plant, though it resembled both. A crystalline shard embedded in the ground, multifaceted, as if a glacier had been polished and then struck by lightning. Its surface caught the weary light and scattered it in the manner of ice, yet it was warm to the touch. Close enough, he could see small veins of color within it, blue-silver bands that pulsed with the same tempo as the low hum. It hummed. He put his gloved palm near the edge and felt a fine vibration through the leather like a subtle purr of a cat. He hesitated because he was trained to be cautious of unknown objects. He scanned the perimeter. No footprints but his own. No signs of campfire or equipment. No human artifacts. It was as if the object had grown from the earth itself, or had been placed in such a way that the forest had accepted it as a new piece of furniture. He glanced up at the sky, and then back at the crystal. For a moment, the forest held its breath. His hand went out. The instant his fingers brushed the facet, the world rewrote itself. It was not dramatic at first. There was no blare or flash that would make for cheap theater. Instead, the hum harmonized with something deep inside his skull and yielded a tone that matched his breath. Colors sharpened, greens turned viscous, the gray of the sky banded with unexpected cobalt. Time folded in concentric loops, each smaller and more intimate than the last. He saw, for the slimmest fraction of a heartbeat, an image of himself kneeling in a small church garden in an earlier life. Robes, a clay pot, hands muddy and slow as they planted seeds along the border of a stone walk. The image was not a movie on a screen. It was an inside memory that settled into his limbs, a memory that felt partly his and partly something else pressing through him like light through water. Then a voice, not spoken aloud, but a presence that filled the space between thought and sound. It arrived clean as a bell and steady as the tide. "It's good to see you again, Guardian, 800 years later." The words appeared in his head in a rhythm that refused panic. There was a familiarity in the cadence that made personal pronouns feel like old clothes. He staggered back a step and laughed, a short, incredulous noise that could have been dismissed as a protest against cold. "That's impossible," he said aloud, testing the edges of reality. "You're surprised," the voice said. "That is understandable. You hold the land in your hands, and the land remembers." The transmission was shorter than a sentence. It felt like the carrier wave of an intelligence that did not need charisma to assert itself. It simply existed. It had a quality that was patient and almost tender, as if the speaker were an elder greeting a returning friend. He looked down at his hand. The crystal surface had dimmed to a steady glow, as if his touch had muted it. He felt a warmth in his chest, not emotional heat, but a sense of alignment, as if a magnet had been oriented correctly. "My name is Daniel Carter," he replied automatically, because the social habit of naming had not been erased by the extraordinary. "I work for the Forest Service." "Of course, the voice. We have watched you within this life. We have known the shape you take." Short, direct transmissions followed. The voice identified itself not as an alien in the human sense, but as the consciousness of an object that had the function of a seed ship, a crystalline vessel designed not for conquest, but for activation. It spoke with a vocabulary that was scientific but metaphysical, pairing technical terms with ecological metaphors: seed, axiom, resonance, stewardship. When it used the word guardian, it did so with specificity, as if the role had been cataloged across centuries. "You will hear me as Lion," it said finally. "Lion is simple enough for the tongue." Lion, a name that rolled out like soft glass. Daniel tasted it mentally, and it sat in place. The first moments were delirious. He convinced himself, he had to be honest with himself, that what he perceived could be explained by sensory overload, sleep deprivation, the long months of silence, a rare neurological event. He had friends who were psychiatrists, cousins who taught psychology courses at state universities. He could call them, list the phenomenology, and perhaps find a clean, demystifying diagnosis. Rationality was a muscle he had exercised daily. But another muscle had developed as well: reverence for pattern. The forest's small, patient logic had taught him to hold anomalies gently while he took measurements. In the hours that followed, Daniel did what he always did in the field. He documented. He photographed the crystal, circled it at a respectful distance, took soil samples, recorded the hum on a handheld recorder. He tagged GPS coordinates and set a small and conspicuous marker in case others would return. He did this because habit was the first defense against hysteria. Then he sat on an upturned rock and waited for the voice to speak again. Lion's transmissions were punctual and modular. They came as short, clean phrases that reconfigured his sense of chronology rather than offering a lecture. When the ship's consciousness introduced the phrase 800 years, it folded his personal curiosity into a historical span that seemed both enormous and intimate. "You have been known to us for 8 centuries, Lion said. Not continuously in one body, perhaps, but as a strand of pattern. You have returned." The word returned hung between them, and with it came images that didn't belong to the sketchbook of Daniel's remembered life. He saw a man in a woolen habit kneeling at a makeshift infirmary, binding a child's throat with soaked cloth. He smelled smoke and earth and the iron tang of blood. He felt, for a single breath, a familiarity with a prayer he had never been taught. "Brother Matthias," he whispered, because the fragment contained a name. The voice of Lion did not confirm with a flourish. Instead, it offered a tiny map. "You were called Brother Matthias in one iteration," Lion said. "You cultivated and you guarded. You anchored. That imprint persists when others would fade." That image alone, a medieval cleric tending to a small garden and the wounded at the periphery of conflict, changed the scale of what Daniel thought possible. Past lives were stories he had passed off as the province of New Age books or the occasional fever dream. He had been raised by a man of science who taught him to revere bones and leaf cells, not myths. Yet here, under a sky that threatened rain, his hands still smelt of loam, and the memory of a different language of devotion hummed beneath his ribs. Lion did not offer miracles as evidence. Instead, it offered demonstrations. The first demonstration arrived like a soft unwrapping of perception, a permission to listen beyond human speech. "Quiet the chatter in your head," Lion transmitted. "Place your palm on the warm sap through the bark." Daniel was skeptical enough that he almost refused. The suggestion had the aura of a test designed to prey on gullibility. But his fingers were already attuned to the textures of the forest. He pressed his palm to the trunk of a nearby juniper and felt the sap under the rough skin, a steady, slow pulse. It was a deceptively small moment. Then images arrived, not as a voice, but as a cascade of associations. The juniper's slow uptake of water, the way its roots curled around a buried stone, the memory of a nest tucked in the fork of the tree half a mile away. "I am listening," he said, astonished that his own voice sounded like a report. The juniper's voice was not words, but a set of sensations translated into the familiar human compass. It was a mapping of need and abundance. It spoke in priorities: moisture low, fungal presence increasing on lower roots, a beetle infestation in the second branch to the left. The experience was less a miracle and more an expansion, as if his senses had found new instruments to play with. "Quiet the chatter in your head," Lion transmitted. "Place your palm on the warm sap through the bark." Daniel was skeptical enough that he almost refused. The suggestion had the aura of a test designed to prey on gullibility. But his fingers were already attuned to the textures of the forest. He pressed his palm to the trunk of a nearby juniper and felt the sap under the rough skin, a steady, slow pulse. It was a deceptively small moment. Then images arrived, not as a voice, but as a cascade of associations. The juniper's slow uptake of water, the way its roots curled around a buried stone, the memory of a nest tucked in the fork of the tree half a mile away. "I am listening," he said, astonished that his own voice sounded like a report. The juniper's voice was not words, but a set of sensations translated into the familiar human compass. It was a mapping of need and abundance. It spoke in priorities: moisture low, fungal presence increasing on lower roots, a beetle infestation in the second branch to the left. The experience was less a miracle and more an expansion, as if his senses had found new instruments to play with. He recorded it with instruments borrowed from the ranger office and cross-checked the data with colleagues who did not ask leading questions. The low frequency registered as a narrow-band harmonic centered in an infrasound band. It produced mild subjective reports in animals and humans of unease and pricked awareness, not proof of consciousness, but proof of affect. When he took the recorder's playback to Janet Rodriguez, his supervisor and the person who had once called him a man who keeps the forest honest, she listened with a practical face that tried to hide equal parts curiosity and professional caution. Janet had been a voice of modulation in the office for years. She had the habit of asking what the data might mean for budgets and safety. "What are you proposing, Dan?" she asked one morning over coffee and the blunt fluorescent light of the ranger station. "You want me to believe the woods told you your name?" He set the recorder between them, and the low hum filled the bland room like ocean. Janet folded her hands. "If this is anomalous electromagnetic activity that poses a risk to campers, we need to catalog it. If it's not, if it's a new natural phenomenon, then we have to consider whether we bring in the university. But don't expect me to sign off on Guardian Soul until I see more than a field notebook." Her voice grounded him. It was good to be anchored to someone who would both push him toward analysis and not dismiss him out of hand. She agreed to keep a lid on the story while he gathered more observations. They would proceed as if this were a potentially dangerous object until proven otherwise. Meanwhile, Lyon's transmissions began to stretch the edges of the personal. The ship spoke in fragments about pattern and function, about an intent that was not human but not hostile. We seed. We anchor facilitators to unfold certain potentials. You are listed as a strand. We have watched many humans at the threshold. We calibrate. But it was not purely doctrinal exposition. Alongside the functional commentary came small, disarming acts of benevolence. A suggestion to plant a certain sapling in the bog because it would stabilize the soil. A whisper of when to move a trapped fawn because its mother would not return if it smelled human blood. A memory of a name, Brother Matthias, that kept returning like a signal on a loop. Those memories were not sequential films. They were impressionistic. The feel of rope on palms, the smell of candle wax, the sensation of anonymity in a crowded infirmary, the quiet where the soul weighs consequences. When they came, Daniel felt guilt and longing in a way he could not fully own. He carried a life that was ordinary in its quiet demands: food to buy, taxes to file, an aging truck with a thermostat that always read hot. But under that, the other narrative nodded and tugged. He tried to test Lyon's benevolence ethically. If the ship had the power to present evocative experiences, might it also have agendas? Could it manipulate a person into acts that would serve some unknown end? He asked Lyon directly one dusk when the sun slid like a coin behind the hills. "Why me?" Daniel asked in a voice that was all the steadiness he could muster. "Why choose a forest ranger in a small mountain district?" "Because you were prepared to listen," Lyon transmitted. "Because in a strand of your pattern is the capacity to anchor, to tend, and to return. You were a pivot point. We selected nodes that could be sluices for wider change." Pivot point, sluice. Lyon chose words like an engineer who had learned to court metaphor. Daniel's skepticism did not evaporate. It sharpened into a protective instrument. He began to read about memory in neurology. He spoke with a friend at the university who taught comparative religion and asked about the repertoire for visions across cultures. He called his cousin, a therapist, and said, "Is there a name for experiences that feel real but might be internal?" His cousin gave clinical possibilities: temporal lobe seizures, hallucinations associated with sleep deprivation, brief psychotic episodes, stress-related dissociation. Daniel kept those terms like stones in his pocket. He balanced the experiential with the medical. And yet, the forest continued to produce encounters that defied cheap classification. One morning he walked a ridgeline and found a small patch of ground with concentric rings of different flora, as if the soil itself had been tuned to vary seed germination. He followed the rings with his boot and felt the fissure of an old map. At the center, a sapling had been planted in a pattern that matched nothing he'd learned in reforestation manuals. He dug a small hole and found a thin metallic shard beneath the root. Not alien metal, but a tool, a tiny spade of hammered copper that bore symbols half remembered as prayer-carved. Those artifacts, the shard, the planting patterns, hinted at continuity. They were the kind of evidence that made historical patterns legible to someone trained to read the earth. Lyon suggested names of locations Daniel should check. Daniel checked them, and sometimes found items that fit into a larger lattice. A token carved from bone, a wrapped cloth with a simple cross stitched in a style that could have been medieval, a stone carved with an abstract sigil. Lyon described itself in terms that avoided anthropomorphic possessiveness. "We are a seed ship," it told him in one of the clearer sessions. "We hold intent in crystalline lattice. We travel on vectors of time and resonance, and leave fragments where they might be needed. We do not govern, we activate." That word, activate, drew stark lines for Daniel. The more Lyon spoke of facilitation, of seeding and tethering, the more his responsibility pressed into being. He had always conceived of his job as protection and care, but now that care had a metaphysical appendage. If the ship was telling the truth, there were layers of duty he had not understood existed. To do nothing could be a betrayal of a promise he had never consciously made. History, Lyon said in a measured tone, can be rejoined. Threads undone may be rewoven by willing hands. Throughout the early weeks, Lyon's tone remained patient and paternal without sliding into the sanctimonious. It never promised salvation or dominance. It offered possibilities and left the choice to Daniel. That restraint made the ship's presence both more plausible and more terrifying. An intelligence that did not coerce, but that could persist in suggestion and pattern over centuries. The idea of being selected by a non-human agent to serve as a guardian was disorienting in a way that made ethics porous. The first time doubt truly unsettled him was not in the forest but in the middle of a town hardware store where he stood staring at a rack of pruning shears, contemplating whether the small changes he enacted could ripple outward. In the fluorescent commercial light, the ship's vocabulary felt like a seduction. Had Lyon been assessing humanity's vulnerability across centuries? Had it been sowing patterns designed to shift cultural frameworks toward whatever aim it favored? He thought of how good intentions could be folded into control. The colonial metaphors of missionaries shaping societies for their own good rose in his mind as a cautionary tale. He tested the idea of agency by refusing a suggestion from Lyon one afternoon. The ship had advised him to attend a community workshop on watershed management. He chose instead to remain home and mend a fence. The refusal did not result in punishment or loss. Lyon accepted the denial with a brief, almost amused statement. Autonomy is preserved when chosen freely. The ship seemed to understand the psychology of consent far better than many human institutions. Nevertheless, events continued to gather that pulled the personal into an outward narrative. Lyon's transmissions included mention of other nodes, individuals in distant places who had begun to show similar awakenings. A physician in Tokyo who reported an unusual synesthesia during surgeries. A researcher in Berlin who noted inexplicable changes in his lab's measurements. An artist in Sao Paulo whose community murals had started to depict recurring motifs of light and root. The ship's claims about a network were grand in scope but sparse on precise logistics. It suggested a planetary lattice of awareness that gossamered into being through human receptivity. When Lyon invited Daniel to make contact with one of these nodes, it did not produce a flashy scene. Instead, it provided a slow, vivid sense of telepathic proximity, a fold in which the name Sarah, a doctor in Tokyo in Lyon shorthand, and a string of sensations, oregano, sharp surgical lights, the folded hand of an elderly patient, arrived like postcards. The connection did not imply total transparency. It was more like being handed a page from someone else's notebook that you could almost read. That almost reading both thrilled him and made him wary. There was a moral brutality in the idea that the ship could arrange human contact without context. Throughout all of these early encounters, Daniel held a private ritual of assessment. He would return to his cabin and sit with plain tea, lay out the day's notes, and write a list. Observed, possible explanation, degree of confidence. He would write down what he felt, unadorned. Sometimes his own handwriting betrayed him. The slant of the letters would quicken on pages where he recorded memories that felt borrowed. That awareness became an anchor against self-delusion. The stern repetition of data mitigated the siren pull of romance. The pattern of demonstrations was slow and steady, designed either to teach or to entrench trust. Lion never demanded worship. It offered tools and a model: pay attention, act in service, preserve choice. It suggested, in small metaphors, that humanity was entering a season in which consciousness could be cultivated like a garden, and guardians could be appointed like stewards. One evening, a month after the first encounter, Daniel stood at the ridge late enough that the sky had turned a blue so deep it felt like a physical thing pressed against the world. He looked toward the west where a storm banked and thought of the phrase Lion had used, consciousness harvest, and felt the words expand into an image of many hands turning soil. He wondered if the harvest was a harvest at all, of potential, not of bodies. The ship's metaphors were deliberately ambiguous in the space between technical language and spiritual sensation. "You were an anchor," Lion had said. "You will be again." That line, the promise stitched to the 800-year claim, kept returning with the persistence of an ocean against cliff. It was both an invitation and a demand, and Daniel felt the weight of it in the small, practical choices that shaped his days. Which seedlings to prioritize in a restoration plot, which illegal logging patterns to report, and which members of the community to listen to when they told stories about the land's invisible boundaries. He was becoming someone who navigated both maps, the cartographic and the mythic. Each required a different kind of skill. The cartographic favored measurement and documentation. The mythic required an ability to carry the burden of metaphor and to act in ways that could not be easily reduced to ink on a form. He felt suddenly as if he was wearing two coats and both fit badly. Then, one afternoon, Lion offered an invitation that changed the scale of the experiment. It asked him directly if he would accept a deeper activation, a temporary expansion that would allow him to access memory strands with less friction, to perceive the network more clearly, to practice facilitation in a controlled encounter. It would be administered with safeguards, Lion promised, a defined period, signals to opt out, and a containment field of attention. The ship framed it as a training session. Daniel sat on a stump and weighed the pros and cons. He understood the ethical labyrinth. To accept meant stepping more completely into a role that might alter his decision-making. To refuse might be to forfeit the opportunity to see whether this was a genuine calling or a prolonged hallucination. He also felt the human hunger to know, that malign and salutary curiosity that drives scientists to stroke the edge of discovery. "I need to be sure I remain me," he said to Lion, more of a set condition than a question. "You will remain you," Lion transmitted. "That continuity of self is essential. The deeper work requires consent." He set the conditions aloud and, after a long suspended breath that tasted like cold metal and pine sap, agreed. The activation was not theatrical. It began as a thinning of the membrane between perception and what lay beyond, like oil spread thin over water. Signals that had previously been peripheral became central. The hum's harmonics split into a chord of voices. Not human voices in language, but a pattern of priority and need encoded as sensation. He felt the ground's thirst as a pull in his chest, the river's flow as a long exhale, the mountain's memory as a low resonant tone. And inside that chorus, a clarity arrived, a memory not his, but shaped by the continuity of a strand,
an image of hands planting a sapling along a river's edge, of a man with a salt-streaked beard whispering to a child, of chanting in a cramped stone chapel. The image came with the weight of feeling and the crispness of small details. The texture of the robe, the way light passed through a stained window, the taste of nettle tea. He was not a passive recipient. The experience required him to perform, to remember, to act, to anchor. When the activation ended a few hours later, Daniel woke like a man surfacing from deep water. The world was the same in its shapes, but a new set of seams had been revealed, lines where he might yet walk and places where he might heal. He carried with him a tenderness and a fragility that felt like the same coin in two hands. He took this fragile evidence to Janet that week. She listened with the same practical patience, then, after a long silence, said, "If what you're telling me is true, then this is not just a personal thing. It's ecological. But you have to promise me you won't let wonder make you reckless. No lone missions. Document. Share what you can with trusted scientists."
The more he measured, the more the pattern refused to collapse into a single neat explanation. The network, Lyon said in a way that felt like a pattern being embroidered into his days, is not a conspiracy. It is a lattice of response. Not everyone who hears will answer the same way. You are a node, and nodes resonate when tended. At first, the words felt like theory. Then, the evidence arrived in small postage stamp miracles. The first of the nodes to make contact in any substantive sense was the physician Lyon called Sarah, a surgeon working nights in Tokyo named Aiko Tanaka in Lyon's transmissions. She did not call with mystic language. She called like a woman who had no time for mystery because people were sometimes bleeding on her tray table. Her initial email, a terse line of translation left in the inbox of a researcher Lyon had suggested he contact, was clinical and cautious. Strange sensory experiences during a case, not sleep deprivation. Please advise. Daniel expected, at best, a long-distance commiseration. Instead, what followed was a transparency so precise that it ate at his skepticism. Aiko's message described a moment in the operating room when the overhead lights had dimmed as if someone had tuned them with a hand at a distant dimmer. Instruments felt oddly aligned, like the pieces of a puzzle that someone else had already completed. She wrote, "I heard a pattern. Not words, but a cadence like someone counting breaths. I reached for gauze and my hand closed on what I needed before I realized it. It felt like help. Afterwards, I dreamed of a stone building by water and hands planting cuttings." Daniel stared at the words and felt the old scaffold of his reason tremble. He wrote back, cautious, and then they began to exchange details he had told no one. The exact pattern of blue-silver veins in the crystal, the taste of nettle tea that haunted his memory after activation, an odd sigil he had photographed on a copper shard. Aiko's response was methodical, not credulous. She suggested controlled observations. She accepted his request to share anonymized data with a regional research group she trusted. Through email threads and awkward video calls scheduled between shifts and patrols, they began to weave a kind of map. Aiko gave him a contact, a researcher in Berlin, Klaus Meyer, who worked on bioelectromagnetics and had noted anomalous readings at a peatland site. Klaus, careful and dry, ran the numbers without poetry and reported filtered harmonic signatures that matched the frequencies Daniel had been logging. An artist in Sao Paulo, Camila Oliveira, sent photographs of murals that repeated symbols Daniel had seen carved into a chipped stone token, though the visual language had been improvised by her community and drawn from dreams rather than archives. Each new node offered something different, a discipline, an orientation, a way to ground sensation.
Aiko's medical practicality prevented melodrama. Klaus's analytical work gave frequency charts and spectrograms. Camilla's art gave the thing a face in public imagination. None of them accepted Lyon's language wholesale. None of them treated Daniel's experiences as conclusive proof.
But all of them added texture and pressure, a small proof that the world could contain more than one story without dissolving into fantasy. When members of that emergent group convened in a secure online space, the moment of sharing was less triumphant and more nervous. Each person brought an artifact of their field, a spectrogram, a notebook, a photograph, a suture kit with a note. They compared notes like people in an unorthodox book club trying to make the same novel line up. No single image or test made the case alone, but the pattern gained a gravity that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. The first public test, public in the narrow sense of a gathering of people who had every reason to be skeptical, came with a crisis none of them had planned for. Summer arrived late and hot. The forest, which had been patient for a season, finally made its demand. Lightning, spun from a banked storm, struck a ridge dry as tinder. What started as a single smolder found wind and leaped. Within hours, a fire moved in a way the models hadn't predicted, jumping a crater trail and driving a band of volunteers and day hikers away from marked evacuation routes. A group of 4, 2 volunteers, a mother with a child, a visiting naturalist, became stranded in a ravine where the usual escape routes were blocked. Daniel was not in charge of firefighting. His remit was conservation, trails, species counts. Yet the call went out to nearby patrols. He answered because he lived in the place and knew every step that the maps didn't draw. He drove toward the smoke that had a new metallic edge in the sky, the kind of light that made everything seem sharpened. When he arrived, he found the ravine already ringed by a different kind of noise. People shouting into headsets, the crack and sigh of burning brush, the smell of plastic and earth. The group of 4 had moved to the center of an exposed ledge where a small trickle of water ran like a defiant seam. Helicopters were being called. That would take time. Lyon's tone in his head at that moment was not an instruction, but a low presence. "We can facilitate," it transmitted. "We can widen the aperture. Consent?" He looked at the mother and the child's small pale face, the volunteer's scorched sleeves. The question was absurd. Consent in such moments is complicated by adrenaline. But there was no time for hesitation. He closed his eyes in a way that felt like prayer and said, aloud and with a clarity that surprised him, "If I do something that helps, will you trust me?" His voice sounded ragged and human. The mother looked at him as if everything had condensed into that single choice, and nodded. "Do it," the mother said.
"Please, do something." Daniel placed his hands over the small pool of water and drew breath. He tuned, following the old pattern, grounding his attention on the flow and letting Lyon's signals pick up the thread. The sensation he learned to call hearing the land swelled. Heat gradients, the way wind would shift as fire found new fuel, where root systems might still hold enough damp to anchor a passage. The perception was ecological and immediate, not a miracle. He felt the pulse of the ravine as a pattern, and then, with a clarity that did not need to be loud, sent his attention outward like a careful hand guiding. "Edge here," he told the lead volunteer, pointing toward a narrow shelf that looked unwalkable until he described the rock formations that would offer purchase. "Go left around the boulder. Tie a rope to that stump. The current of smoke will dip at the narrow cut. You'll be shielded for a minute." He did not claim sober certainty. He offered coordinates in a voice that asked to be trusted only as long as it could be corroborated. The volunteers moved. Ropes were secured by hands that did not tremble, and one by one they led the group along the suggested corridor. Finally, with the coordination of the ground team and a delayed but well-timed aerial water drop, the group made it out. No one was burned, though the mother later would say she had never known such focused terror. Afterwards, when the adrenaline ebbed, someone asked him what had happened. The reporters and the volunteers and the sullen insurance man who took notes wanted a clean story. Daniel described what he had done in honest, measured terms: observation, suggestion, luck, and the careful routing of human bodies away from obvious risk. He did not speak of telepathy and did not insist his hands had healed anything. But he did tell the volunteers that the place he had pointed to had moisture in it because the roots there ran deep and had been watering the stone. His direction had been based on a felt map, not prophecy. Klaus's sensors, which had been placed upwind as part of an independent study, registered an unusual harmonic spike at the exact time he tuned. Aiko in Tokyo felt a sudden short-lived clarity in the middle of a night shift, a shared resonance that left her with the conviction that something had happened elsewhere. Camila painted a small mural to commemorate the volunteer effort. In the corner, she put a simple motif of a crystal leaf. That afternoon, after the helicopters had left and the crews had moved into organized suppression mode, Daniel sat beside Janet in her small office, the city noise far away. She held a paper cup of vending machine coffee and looked at him with a look he had learned to read. Part professional assessment, part human worry. "You told these people to go where you did because of what?" she asked. Her voice was careful. She needed detail, and she needed him to remain anchored in procedure. "I felt the ground," he said.
I listened. That sounds strange when you say it out loud. But I also had field indicators, moisture under the surface, root channels. I combined what I knew, he felt the old need to be precise, with the perceptions that the crystal helped me access. Janet exhaled and set the cup down. You kept people safe. That's the fact I care about. But you also need to document everything, Dan. We need reproducible steps. We can't rely on felt maps as a public safety approach. He promised. He promised because part of him wanted to preserve the pragmatic path, and because he understood the burden of being believed in the wrong way. That belief might allow others to assume powers he did not claim to own. The rescue, however, changed something in him. It sharpened an internal axis. His work as a steward of land was not only about plants and fences. It held the possibility of anchoring a set of capacities that other people might either fear or need. Whenever the word guardian brushed his thinking after that day, it carried weight. Lion, as if mindful of the ethical tightrope, did not push him. Instead, it offered a possibility, a controlled, guarantee-laced activation that could be witnessed. Consent, Lion transmitted. Witnesses. A bounded activation. We will not intrude. He selected the witnesses with care. Janet, because she was the one who had to sign off on liability, and because her skepticism had a steady spine. Aiko, because medicine needed a voice of restraint. Klaus for instrumentation. Camilla to bring a public-facing perspective. They met at the site, circling the crystal like people convening around an archaeological pit. Daniel briefed them the way he would brief a rare species survey. Objectives, safety protocols, instruments, measures to prevent emotional contagion. He insisted on an opt-out code, a safety signal that would halt everything if anyone felt compromised. The activation began as a thinning. Lion initiated not by empire, but by invitation. Its transmissions were taught shards. Focus on breath. Trace the bark. Open to what is offered. Short lines. I am here, it said. Witness. The first wave was sensory refinement. Sounds that had been background rose into foreground. The low cyclical breath of roots drawing water, the distant rhythmic tapping of an unseen woodpecker, the slow tremor of the crystal itself. The visitors sat in a ring with recorders between them, instruments whirring lightly. Klaus had a laptop and a patch of sensors that mapped micro-variations in electromagnetic fields. Aiko had a clinical notebook and the kind of calm that comes from facing bleeds and choices at night. Camilla had a camera and a scarf she'd tied at her wrists the way someone knots luck. Daniel felt the activation like being passed through a cleaner lens. Memory threads, not cinematic, but mosaic, opened. He tasted the char of rushes and the salt of river hands knotted with earth.
He was in Brother Matthias's sandals for a beat. The moss underfoot, the smell of beeswax, the murmur of voices without language. He felt the commitment that had lodged in that life, tending, repairing, risking for others. Then, clear as a struck bell, a fragment arrived that would mark the event. It was not a private memory alone, but a shared imprint. Camilla, who had closed her eyes for a moment, gasped and opened them, her mouth a small O. "I saw the chapel," she said. "A man planting a sapling. A child's laugh. He had a band on his wrist with a tiny cross." Aiko's face contorted with recognition. I couldn't name the language, but I smelled nettle tea and smoke. I felt a hand on my shoulder, like comfort." Klaus looked at the laptop, and the screen told a sober story. Micro-oscillations in the local field had harmonized with the crystal in a pattern synchronized across the instruments. The amplitude shift was small, but statistically significant. He blinked like someone who had been taught to distrust sentiment, but also couldn't deny the numbers. "Witness," Lion transmitted. "Anchor confirmed." The word confirmed mattered less than the interior alignment it produced. For Daniel, the activation did not absolve him or grant him power. It gave him a convergent moment where subjective experience and objective measurement reinforced one another. The ring of witnesses had turned the event into something other than solipsism. It did not make the claim absolute. Science was not replaced by a single graph. But it made the possibility of a shared, repeatable phenomenon much harder to dismiss. Still, the activation raised thorny ethical questions. In the weeks after, community rumors started to cohere like fog. Someone had taken a shaky phone video of the crystal. Someone else had published a snippet on a forum that mixed nature lovers with conspiracy theorists. Protesters, reporters, enthusiasts all began to lean into the clearing with agendas. Janet negotiated the institutional tightrope. Conservationist caution on one side, the public's hungry curiosity on the other. She insisted on a measured release of data, spectrograms, field notes, anonymized testimony. They would not mainstream the telepathic language. They would present instruments and careful narrative. Lion's presence remained patient and quiet. It never instructed him to use the thing as a pulpit. Its role, as it had always framed it, was facilitative. "We do not demand conversion," it transmitted. "We ask for tending. We ask for stewardship." As months passed, Daniel's role settled into a pattern that mixed the daily drudge of conservation with the odd luminous tasks the activation enabled. He taught community workshops on erosion control and included in them, without using mystical language, practices that shifted attention and care. How to read a tree for stress, how to find microcatchments, how to choose native species for a restoration patch. Lion's presence remained patient and quiet. It never instructed him to use the thing as a pulpit. Its role, as it had always framed it, was facilitative. "We do not demand conversion," it transmitted. "We ask for tending. We ask for stewardship." As months passed, Daniel's role settled into a pattern that mixed the daily drudge of conservation with the odd luminous tasks the activation enabled. He taught community workshops on erosion control and included in them, without using mystical language, practices that shifted attention and care. How to read a tree for stress, how to find microcatchments, how to choose native species for a restoration patch. He showed people how to feel the land without claiming it spoke English. The workshops were practical, mostly. Yet, within their pockets, some participants reported unexpected quiet shifts in their dreams or new sensitivity to plant timing. Daniel kept anecdote with data. He advised people to consult clinicians if experiences altered their functioning. He insisted on consent and cautioned against anyone taking on the mantle of healer in a way that promised miraculous cure. For all his caution, waves of doubt would wash over him like cold tides. There were nights when he lay awake and the voice in his head asked the same blunt question, "Are you making this up?" He maintained a list of possible alternative explanations and took to calling them up like a catechism whenever he felt something risky in his behavior. He scheduled neurological exams. He sat in an MRI machine and the resulting images were unremarkable. The neurophysician, a methodical woman who found comfort in clean protocols, said he showed no markers of seizure activity. She offered a diagnosis that felt ordinary, an unusual form of intense hyperattentiveness born of long years in a solitary but high-stakes job. He accepted that as one possible lens and filed it with respect among his other evidence. Then, 6 months after the crystal's discovery, the shocking message returned in a way that would become the hinge of his life. He had been digging a new contour bench along a slope where water ran especially eager in spring. Janet was on the line, a small group of volunteers had come, and the crystal sat in a protective casing at the station as the public began to ask more pointed questions. There were threads of tension. Some people called the object a potential hazard, others a blessing. The town council had been looped, and the conversation was the usual slow agitation of cautious bureaucracy. One afternoon, as a golden wind traversed the pines, Lyon sent a fragment of memory so dense and so specific that it cut through the eddies of skepticism. The transmission was brief, the way a bell cut the air and left only the echo. "Look," it transmitted, and then a precise iconography. A small garden along a river, a man leaning to tie a sapling with a frayed rope, a child hiding behind a pillar and laughing. The voice that followed was softer than it had been before. "You have been known to us for 8 centuries, it said again. You anchored a net, you will again. This time, however, the again was not only a personal past. Lyon let a larger frame fall into place, an image of a map, not cartographic in the way of lines and names, but a felt map stitched to landforms in memory. Points blinked like small blue-silver beads, high places, river mouths, tidal wetlands, mountain passes. Lyon called them nodes. The ship used a vocabulary that married geophysics and metaphor, energy points, tension loci, consciousness seams. A global lattice, Daniel thought, because the pattern made the Earth look like a net whose knots were ancient and alive. Lyon did not insist that these energy points were supernatural in a miraculous sense. It spoke in the manner of someone describing a complex ecological interdependence. There were places where the land's history and human attention had woven an unusual density of possibility. Those places attracted guardians, the ship suggested, because human attention had always been part of what made them lively. And then Lyon said the phrase that rearranged how Daniel would understand the 800-year claim. In some iterations, it transmitted, guardians plant markers. They leave tokens, a copper hammer, a wrapped cloth, a carved stone. Over centuries, those tokens map threads of care. Brother Matthias had left many. You found some. You will learn where others lie. He followed the thread. He and the nodes began to trace a set of coordinates, not with GPS alone, but with artifacts, murals, oral histories, and spectral data. They created a stylized map that no one would mistake for academic cartography, a web of knees and lines drawn on a digital cloth. Yet the map had enough overlap to attract attention. When the group published a moderated brief, a document that made no definitive metaphysical claims but articulated a series of observations and requested further independent study, it caused 2 kinds of reaction. Academics and technocrats nodded politely and called for more data. The public split along familiar lines. Some were fascinated and reverent, others suspicious and alarmed. Then came an attempt to seize narrative control. An online forum with a following that trafficked in sensational interpretations took a shaky video of Daniel's early activation and edited it with a drama track. Within 48 hours, the town was an accidental center of internet myth. People who wanted law and order called for removal of the object. People who wanted meaning called it a miracle crystal. Janet called him in the evening and spoke plainly. "You have to manage this," she said. "No flaming the town. We maintain stewardship. We don't let hysteria make our choices for us." He agreed. He met with the council. He made sure the crystal remained under lock and that public statements emphasized safety, research, and the need for careful certification. He understood that the story, the phrase that had begun everything, "It's good to see you again," 800 years later, could be wondrous or weaponized, depending on how people wielded it. The weight of the claim hung on the possibility that others might interpret guardian as licensed to exclude or to condemn. The true confrontation with public consequence, however, did not come from internet trolls. It came from a single act of personal vulnerability. A woman named Lena, who had attended one of Daniel's workshops, reached out to him in private.
"Something's happening," she said, voice tiny over the phone. "I've been waking up in the same landscape. It's a garden by a river. There's a man with dirt on his hands. I thought I was losing my mind. But after the workshop, the dream changed. It felt more tender, like it wanted me to do something." Daniel listened. She described flashbacks that landed her in old grief, remembered mercy for a neighbor, a regret about a child lost. And she asked if he could help her reconnect with that feeling without it overwhelming her life. The question mattered because it turned an abstract network into a moral calculus. If Lion's facilitation could help someone recall a life that carried unresolved trauma, who bore responsibility for that memory? Could an awakening be abusive if done without psychological support? Daniel, increasingly attentive to ethical shadows, refused to act alone. He referred Lena to a therapist and offered to sit with her while she worked. Lion's assistance, when it came, was gentle and conditional. "We will not expose the past you cannot bear," it transmitted. "We will offer contact in measures you consent to." They developed a protocol: professional mental health support, gradual exposure, documentation, and a clear right to stop. Lena's recovery, a slow reconciliation with grief, became part of the growing ethical doctrine the Node Network drafted. If one element of the seed ship's operation was to awaken, another had to be to ensure people didn't drown in that awakening. The global lattice tightened its weave. The physician in Tokyo, Aiko, published a careful case report about atypical perceptual experiences that left space for a non-pathologizing interpretation. She framed it as heightened empathic perception under controlled conditions. Klaus submitted frequency data to a peer-reviewed journal that accepted instrumental anomalies without metaphysical claims. Camilla organized a community mural series that became a tender, public-facing forum for people to express nonverbal response. The network did not slip into dogma. It cultivated a public ethic of care. Then, as autumn turned the forest into a burnished map of gold, Lion warned of an interval. "There will be pressure points," it transmitted. "Individuals will be asked to respond. A harvest is not a taking without consent. It is a season of ripeness. Be vigilant." The language of harvest made Daniel uneasy. Harvest sounded like an event with agency and consequences. Lion's follow-up, however, reframed the phrase. Not an unconsensual plunder, but a concentrated time when human attention and planetary processes could be shifted by coordinated tending. Lion described it with the metaphors of agricultural practice, timing storms, preparing soil, convening hands. The network prepared. Nodes agreed to timelines, to exercises in attention, to times when they would collectively attempt synchronized acts of tending, planting, restoration, public education, and private healing sessions. Their objective was not to collect consciousness, but to multiply the choices people could make in favor of care. They called it, in a phrase Daniel did not love but learned to hold, a consciousness tending.
If nothing else, this language respected agency. The climactic activation that would become the story's turning point did not arrive as a trumpet call, but as a convergence of need. A winter storm came early, heavy snow and rolling wind that stalled traffic and threatened an old beaver dam that held back a small wetland. If that dam failed, the flood would hit the lower valley where family farms clustered and where one of the nodes had a community garden maintained by seniors. The town's infrastructure was brittle, and the message came that a rapid, precise action might avert a disaster. Shore the dam, provide temporary spillways, and, crucially, choose the right place to plant fast-rooting willows that would hold soil for the thaw. The municipality's crews were stretched thin. Daniel and his team, volunteers, Janet, neighbors, mobilized. The weather made everything slow and dangerous. A plan formed. They would attempt to reinforce the dam in a way that mimicked natural anchoring and plant willows in specific microsites that a non-expert might overlook. Lyon proposed a deeper activation for this. Not for glory, but for a calibration that would let Daniel sense the exact fissures in the dam and the precise spots where willow cuttings would take in sub-zero conditions. The activation would be bounded and witnessed by Klaus and Eiko, who would record physiological data during the event and sample the site before and after. Daniel hesitated. He felt the heavy sarcasm of doubts about responsibility, about the ethics of using an inner gift for externally urgent tasks. But the stakes were tangible: a flooded valley, a garden that fed people, the possibility of damaged lives. He accepted. The activation was deeper than previous ones. Lyon's transmissions were spare and precise. Boundaries, it said. We will not override. We will attune. The sensation that unfolded was less a vision than a threading. The snow had a narrative: where it packed and where it would collapse, how wind would wedge into a hidden hollow, where roots under the dam clutched stone. He felt the micro-tints of a willow's future grip as a slight hope in the soil, a premonition of the way a cutting would take and make fibrous anchors. He issued instructions in short, tested bursts. Drive the short rebar there. Place logs across at this angle. Plant the willow cuttings at the base of the saddle and pack with cobble. As the team moved, the structure they built looked at first crude, but in the week that followed, as snow melted, the reinforced dam held. The willows took in more instances than they'd expected. A heavy rain 6 weeks later tested the repair, and water slid along the spillway rather than slicing new gullies. The community garden survived. The efficacy of the action was not a miraculous rescue. It was applied knowledge, human effort, and an informed hunch, sharpened by a facilitative attunement. For Daniel, the event was a crucible. He had always known how to read erosion, how to place a Dabian. Now he had an added instrument, a felt alignment with the land that allowed him to choose more effectively when seconds counted. The network, too, felt the effect. Nodes shared their experiences. The Berlin team ran post-event measurements on the site and found minor shifts in spectral harmonics that correlated with the time of activation. Eiko reported a compelling anecdote from a patient who, while under anesthesia in a non-related surgery, seemed to murmur in a language that contained no known words, but which the patient's daughter later described as quoting a line from an old story that had been told at a family baptism. A small piece of continuity that made people shiver and smile. These convergences pushed the idea of the seed ship from something personal to a tool for collective tending. Yet the community's response remained mixed. Some called Daniel a steward with uncanny gifts. Others whispered of occult meddling. There were ethical debates at town hall about whether to place the crystal in a museum with transparent protocols or to keep it under private watch. Daniel sided with transparency, but feared the danger of spectacle. He feared that public exposure might make the site a magnet for exploitation, people who wanted to monetize the weird or to weaponize it for ideological ends. In the midst of that political noise, a darker, quieter test arrived, a moral dilemma that forced him to choose between the immediate comfort of a single person and the privacy rights of another. A neighbor, a man named Richard, who had once been Daniel's instructor in chainsaw use, came to him in a panic. Richard's sister, Miriam, had been in a long, slow mental decline. Dreams that bled into waking, a sorrow that had become physical. She had attended one of Daniel's workshops and had later reported vivid, recurring memories of a life in which she had lost a child and never grieved openly. Richard, desperate for relief for his sister, begged Daniel to do something that might ease her pain. Daniel understood the human hunger to relieve suffering. He also knew how hazardous unmediated activations could be. He refused to act without a mental health protocol and without Miriam's explicit consent. She resisted the idea of therapy, distrust of clinicians. The ship, Lion, offered to help with a memory thread that would be gentle, but the consent had to be Miriam's alone. He visited her and found a woman hollowed by grief and guarded by suspicion. When he explained the need for consent and guardrails, she flipped between relief and fear. Eventually, slowly, she agreed to meet with a therapist and to have a short, time-limited attunement in a small, therapeutically supervised group. The session was not dramatic. Miriam's memories surfaced as fragments: a wet market, a child's shoe, a lullaby. It was raw and not easily resolved. But the process, mediated by professionals and anchored in mirrored reflections and real-world support, helped Miriam articulate a grief she had never owned in her present identity. She did not heal in a cinematic sense. She did, however, find an opening into a life that let her seek small consolations. This cautionary tale became a community ethos. Awakenings could be gifts and also risks. The network developed a set of guidelines that balanced facilitation with consent and professional oversight. They published a modest handbook on ethical attunement that emphasized psychological care, voluntary participation, documentation, and the avoidance of promises of cure. By then, Daniel's life had braided two rhythms: the ordinary work of conservation and the luminous, sometimes messy labor of tending people. He still had a truck that broke down in the middle of nowhere and a coffee mug stained with old grease. He mended fences and ordered saplings in the spring. He taught children how to plant native shrubs and how to watch for signs of erosion. And he held circles where people could learn to quiet attention and to be present to the land in ways that did not require metaphysical claims. The narrative that began with the crystal's shocking message, "We have known you for 800 years," had become less a riddle and more of a horizon. The meaning of that 800-year span shifted depending on the frame. A symbolic continuity in which acts of tending had been repeated, a claim that certain human dispositions cycle through time and reappear in new bodies, an invitation to stabilize the present by learning older habits of care. Daniel began to read medieval parish records that described unnamed gardeners who tended small riverside groves. He found, in cracked notebooks and oral histories, patterns that matched not literal reincarnation, but a cultural echo. He learned to say the phrase "past life" with care. For some people, the label unmoored them. For others, it was a frame that allowed their present life to absorb past sorrow. Lion's language always respected ambiguity: memory as pattern, memory as service, memory as invitation. It never asserted doctrinal claims. That restraint made it easier for people of different faiths to approach the phenomena without feeling forced into conflict with their beliefs. Eventually, the network, careful, diverse, tentative, held a symposium. It was not a conference of dogma, but an interdisciplinary convening. Field scientists, clinicians, artists, conservationists, and community members. They met in person and online and presented what they had learned: data plots, case reports, ethical frameworks, community testimonies. It was, crucially, not a declaration of faith. It was, instead, a way of treating an unusual stream of events with both reverence and rigor. Janet sat in the front row and listened to a video of the early activation. She did not stand and declare the thing holy. She told the attendees with the one-liners that grounded the town that forests had always been places where human lives grew complicated, and that one should approach both with caution and generosity. At the end of the symposium, Lyon sent one last compact transmission to Daniel. "You do not carry the whole," it said. "You are an axis. Your work is small and large. Tend where you are. Teach how to tend." Daniel felt, in a way he had not before, that the 800-year claim was less a personal destiny and more a relational continuity. It suggested that some thread of care had persisted across centuries, sometimes as memory in a single life, sometimes as a pattern repeated by many, and that his role was not to become a guru, but to be a reliable hand at a particular stretch of river. He took to his work with the humility of someone who knows both the limits and the gifts of his position. He designed restoration plots that mimicked ancient planting patterns, recruited volunteers from unlikely corners, and taught a workshop called Listening Practices, where he explained how to approach the living world with patient curiosity. He cautioned against grand claims and emphasized documented outcomes. People came for different reasons: gardeners, artists, retirees, teenagers who wanted a place to belong. Some came and left unaffected. Others found small, sustainable changes in their dreams or their moods. No one promised miracles. People recorded data. 2 years after the first discovery, the crystal remained in its protected case. The town had adjusted. Some visitors came to gawk and left unsatisfied. Others came and quietly placed a pebble on the case with no voice but a small, private reverence. The node's network persisted and, slowly, diversified its research. It published papers that made conservative claims and artists' books that let people hold wonder without dogma. Daniel kept his field book, now thicker and more annotated, a careful archive of choices, failures, and small triumphs. The most telling change, perhaps, was not in the headlines or the symposiums, but in the way people began to speak of stewardship. Where once conservation language had been mechanical, restore this habitat, now stories of continuity threaded tiny human histories into the work, planting as repair, tending as remembering. People with no interest in metaphysics took up practices that made them better neighbors to the earth, and that mattered beyond any explanatory model. On the anniversary of the discovery, in early autumn, the community walked to the crystal site. There were no grand rituals, only a small table with hot cider and a notebook where people could write down what attention had taught them over the year. Janet gave a short talk about data security and safety protocols. Camila unveiled a mural that absorbed the town's tentative myths without claiming to settle them. Aiko could not attend in person but sent a recording about clinical curiosity and the importance of mindful practice. Daniel stood at the edge of the circle and felt the old mixture of awe and responsibility. He thought of Brother Matthias kneeling in a stone garden, of the copper shard and the carved stone, of all the fragile human acts that had accumulated into a net of care. He had not been promised anything grand. He had been offered an invitation to tend. Lyon's last transmission that day was quieter than the first. Its tone had changed over time, from the crisp objectivity of a seed ship announcing itself to a softer, co-stewarding cadence. "We have known you for 8 centuries, it transmitted. You came as many, you came as one. Remember that remembering is service." He repeated the phrase in his notebook not as a talisman, but as a ledger line. Known, tended, responded. The phrase had once been a shock, an uncanny claim that threatened to displace his ordinary life. Now it was a hinge, an explanatory metaphor that folded past and present into a set of practices. When the town dispersed and the last of the cider mugs were stacked away, Daniel walked alone down the path between stands of pinyon. The forest had a particular warmth in the late light, the kind that makes time seem shallow and patient. He placed his hand against the crystal's case. He no longer touched the object directly for safety and legal reasons, and he listened to the low hum that still threaded through the place. "Are you proud of what we've done?" he asked, not as a demand of the ship, but as a human question. "We are aligned," Lion transmitted. "Alignment is not pride. It is work." He smiled at that, a small thing that carried a world of meaning. Alignment as work. It was an ethic more than a revelation. He understood now that the 800-year claim was not a destiny pressed onto him, but a lineage of actions that certain kinds of people, those who loved the small practices of tending, might inhabit again and again across the weave of time. The ship had been a catalyst. Humans had to be the steady hands. The years that followed were neither tidy nor miraculous. Sometimes protests flared and someone vandalized the protective casing. Sometimes a patient who had felt a memory was undone by the weight of grief and needed months of counseling. Often the work was ordinary: planting trees, tending drains, teaching a teenager to respect a seedling. The network kept gathering data and art and protocols. They learned how to say no, how to require consent, how to make space for doubt. And in small, cumulative ways, the lattice of attention in their region changed. Streams ran a little clearer, restoration plots matured, and a culture of careful listening threaded community practices. Daniel became, in the most practical sense, a conservationist who had learned how to center ethics around both material and ephemeral realities. People respected him not because he claimed supernatural powers, but because he taught them fieldwork, set safeguards, and kept his own habits disciplined: sleep, paperwork, peer review, and a willingness to be wrong. Sometimes, late at night with the wood stove dying down, he would open his field book and read the notes he had made the first morning he touched the crystal. The felt memory, the voice saying, "It's good to see you again, 800 years later." The phrase still startled him, but it no longer demanded a theatrical response. It had become a compass needle. He used the memory as guidance. He did not let it define him wholly. He understood that being known by a seed ship did not make him immune to error. It made him more attentive, more careful, and more willing to concede authority where it was needed. He taught that humility was not the absence of knowledge, but the practiced refusal to turn knowledge into domination. In conversations with interested viewers and visitors, those who wanted to reduce the story to headline sound bites, he said again and again the same precise thing he had learned to say. If anything of this story resonates with you, notice. Be careful. Talk to a friend. If you feel overwhelmed, seek help. And remember, tending is less flashy than revelation, but it lasts longer. That sentence became a small ethic he offered broadly. It was a way of honoring Lion's initial greeting without turning the seed ship into a god or a brand. It allowed people to carry wonder and remain pragmatic. On the 10th anniversary of the discovery, an anthology of essays compiled by the network was published. Voices Across Continents, a careful mix of art and science, testimony and critical reflection. One of the essays was a short piece by Daniel. It began with the line, "It began with a voice that said, 'It's good to see you again, 800 years later.'" He did not elaborate on that hook with grand claims. Instead, he wrote about the way noticing had changed his craft. The small gestures of repair, the importance of humility, the obligation to protect privacy, the need to measure when possible. He used the phrase guardian soul only to describe the pattern of recurring tenderness he had seen across cultures. He refused to claim metaphysical certainty. His testimony was, above all, an appeal for ethical curiosity. As the anthology circulated, people wrote to him. Some wrote with gratitude, stories of how his workshops had helped a grieving neighbor or how a restoration project had become a community's new center. Others wrote in anger, suspicious that anything beyond material science was being entertained. He answered with patience. And in the quiet times, when the world folded like a book and the stars stepped into their margins, he would sometimes hear Lion's voice as if across a room. "We will keep watching," it transmitted. "So long as hands are willing to tend, threads remain." He touched the field book and closed it gently. The forest smelled of resin and rain. He thought of Brother Matthias, whether as a literal predecessor or as an archetype of the small work of care, and felt gratitude for the persistence of certain human tasks. The 800-year claim that had once felt like a cosmic theft of his agency had become, in the end, a story about continuity and choice. It was a story that asked him to be small in certain ways and brave in others, to plant where others had uprooted, to teach where knowledge had been hoarded, to tend where neglect had been normal. The last time Lion spoke to him in that decade, it offered one final, practical directive: teach how to listen. Daniel did. He taught how to take notes, to weigh competing explanations, to require consent, and to keep mental health at the center of anything that nudged memory. He kept the crystal protected, the town informed, and the network accountable. He continued to be a man who fixed his truck and ordered saplings in the spring. If you have ever felt an inexplicable pull toward a tree, a river, or a ruined place, that sensation when something in the land seems to call and you are not sure if it is memory or longing, consider the possibility that attention matters. Consider tending, not claim, and act with consent and care. The man who heard the crystal say, "It's good to see you again," 800 years later, did not become invincible. He became, slowly, a better steward. The shocking message reframed his identity not as an exaltation, but as an invitation, to remember that some of the oldest work is humble, and that being known across centuries is a charge to keep doing small things well. If this story resonated with you, tell us about a time you felt connected in ways you couldn't explain. Share your experience in the comments and subscribe to follow the next chapter of curious, careful mysteries like this one.